So in this case, we want white people's history to stay validized and not validizing marginalized communities and their history and how that is rooted into the university.
I think something that happens often is not just failure to see somebody else's perspective, but just evaluating something differently.
It's okay.
So, let's say the Marquette seal. Excuse me, got some salad working its way down. Like, it is a historically accurate thing that a white guy, took advantage of economic disparity to have a Native American as his guide. That's a thing that happened in real life. So portraying that is value neutral, arguably. But whether you want to see that continued is a discussion. So, like, the history happened. Portraying it can be positive, can be negative, depends on values you attach. And so seeing it from different perspectives is one thing, but evaluating it is a different thing.
But it's because, like, on the seal, it doesn't, like, show, like, the Native American, like giving him directions. It's, like, instead, like, it's, like, the bigger figure is, like, the white man, and he's the one, like, leading, and it, like, totally, like, cuts off, like, on that diagonal, like, the actual, like, leader that was giving him directions and helping him. So I think that's, like, the problem, because, yeah, that's totally right. Like, it did happen. And it is, like, historically accurate, but it, like, the way that it's portrayed, it's like, that's not how it was. That's not how the painting is. Like, and, like, that's the problem.
You're missing the full picture.
Mm-hmm.
And the full picture is the marginalized identities that are always getting cut out of history.
We're going to even question historically accurate. Mm-hmm. Whose history, what lens, what angle is representing it?
I mean, granted, and I agree, I'm a bit of a pragmatist when it comes to history and lens. So if we all add up all of our perspectives, theoretically we get to just the thing that happened, which I think is an important and valuable thing. And then through that discussion, through that incorporation of everybody's lens, we get objectivity, which is a thing, theoretically, that exists. I think getting there, having discussions like this, is the important bit.
Yeah, so how do we have those discussions?
I don't know, how are we doing it now?
Yes, how do we have more of those discussions?
It's also interesting because that discussion becomes highly charged, oftentimes for one side of the group. And then it's like, which I know like that then becomes difficult, is like, if I am like outright offended, and then someone's like, well, yeah, but let's talk about the whole historical context. I'm like, I'm offended right now. I don't want to talk about the historical context. I still remember this was several years back. I think it was like a history department had this old abolitionist poster, and it's of a black man, and they're like, they sent it out like all throughout, like they're like, doing something, so they sent it out to like everybody, and it's like this black man, it's from slavery, and he is like on his knees, only wearing a loincloth and in chains, and it was about freedom. And I was looking at this, I'm like, maybe like back in the abolitionists, like at the time of abolitionism, like when they were like, these are white people trying to feel sorry for black people, and they were trying to use this as a concept of freedom. And I was looking at this as like, especially someone that's half black, and I'm like, I don't see this as empowering of black people at all. Like, this is disempowering in a lot of different ways. So and then I mean, people like came up to the history door and they're like, this is kind of messed up that you're sending this out this way. And they're like, yeah, but that existed. So how do you get in the context of like, yeah, I mean, there is some truth to that history, but we're also at a very different point. And even the representation of that history at that time was marred in viewing black individuals as lesser than. So, and how does that then perpetuate of, in some ways, sending that throughout all the university mail system, are you then also perpetuating that in the same way?
Actually, so National Geographic, actually, their, I think, president wrote about how they, for the last, like, 40, 50 years, they've put images of them going to, like, Africa and being like, oh, these pictures are so exotic, so different. So they actually call themselves out in their history for being actually racist history. Telling it and saying, like, this group is inferior or, like, less than by these pictures showing that those things. So they're acknowledging their history. I think thinking about our mission week and truth to reconciliation, I think if we're to talk about history, being able to say a message and owning up to our history is a really important aspect. And I think people of power sometimes have to take on that issue and be like, yeah, some of the images are not that aspect. And I think that gives a little bit more power to people, just being able to own up to issues.
Yeah, that reminds me of like the H&M thing that happened. You know? So, I forgot, it was like a monkey on the shirt or something like that? Yeah.
The King of the Jungle?
Oh,
Yeah, King of the Jungle, yeah.
It's a
Yeah.
fashion catalog. Fashion.
Oh yeah, so yeah, H&M is a clothing store. So they had like a young boy, African American boy, have like King of the Jungle on his shirt or something like that. And I think there was an image, or maybe I'm not sure. But a lot of people were like, they got a lot of backlash for that, you know, right? Because that could be perceived as a microaggression. But I want to know like who pointed that out. You know, was it like the higher leadership that may be more predominantly white? You know, or like how did that come to their attention? You know, I don't know. Just feel like obviously the designers didn't think that was an issue. You know, no matter what.
And the editors, they had to like approve them. It's like, you know, it went through levels.
Yeah, it goes to different levels. Yeah, you're right. So.
And everyone's like, oh, that's okay.
Yeah.
You're kind of asking, like, how do we notice and respond to microaggressions?
Yeah.
Like in terms of history, it isn't historical because obviously we know history repeats itself time and time again. As far as it being microaggression, what aspects of history do we emphasize or highlight in the present? And how does that make stereotypes or kind of microaggress in the here and now? So I think just a little bit like, yeah, history can be, you can say pragmatic, but I'd still say there's a lens, but also what do we punctuate? Like, I mean, for instance, you watch Fox News about Milwaukee, and you think every black man in Milwaukee is a murderer or robber or something, right? Yet there's all sorts of other history happening, right? I don't see a Fox News story about this space, right? So, but yeah, I think there's lots of ways we can. I think my understanding was a lot of social media buzz kind of outcries for that particular case. So I kind of noticed, responded.
Can I offer, I'm not a psychologist or anything, but I think all these are subconscious, if I'm using the term correctly. When did you learn that green is a good color? I mean, you know.
Oh, are you asking us?
Yeah. Well, I want you to think about it. When did I learn that green was good?
When it was associated with money and my family didn't have it.
Oh, see, I wasn't even thinking about money. I was thinking about the green light on the stoplight and how it's associated with springtime and everything starts to grow and it's green where I grew up. So green is good. But I think those parameters are already set in your mind and spirit before you even could recognize them.
Yeah, I think it's the way society creates it, though.
Yeah.
If you look in the media, like, those subconscious things in the environment, in the system, keep on perpetuating it, and then it becomes what you believe. Like, green is good, do go, and red is stop. So, yeah.
I mean, I think Dr. Howard would be the best person to answer that question because he has a whole class in social psych. So.
Don't put me on the spot. Well, So if we are talking about associations, right? So if we want to frame this in a way of being that this is operating on a subconscious level, because I do think, yes, sometimes it is something that is not deliberate and subconscious, but there is definitely conscious associations. I often look at multiple ways in which we're socialized in a system of white supremacy, which is the United States. We can debate that, but that's the sort of framework in which I take that this is a system that perpetuates white supremacy and that is ideological. So if we have ideological white supremacy, break that down. I'm not talking about clowns and Ku Klux Klan uniforms. I'm talking about the notion and belief that whiteness is superior and blackness is inferior, or non-white is inferior. People don't have to say this explicitly. It's an ideology. You can have non-black, or you can have black individuals who sort of adopt this ideology as well. Anyone can adopt an ideology. So this isn't a code word for white people. This is ideology. Sometimes we reinforce ideology without us even knowing it. So sometimes it is on an unconscious level. One of the things I look at in my work that I think reinforces this white supremacist ideology is, where does it stem from? I look at the church. If you're raised in the church, many of us are raised in the church, the first image that I'm associating with goodness is a white Jesus. I walk into that church, before I even can say grace in Jesus' name, I'm already associating godliness with whiteness. Because Jesus is the Son of God, so therefore God too is white. If I'm learning that, if I'm black, white, Latino, it don't matter, I'm associating God with white. That's one of the biggest, strongest associations that we have. And many black folks and Latino folks are raised in the church. White folks are as well. I can be atheist and still have an association of God with white. So where does it stem from? I look at religion. I'm not saying that's the sole cause of this association, but I think that often gets it often missing from the conversation. We often talk about media. We often talk about schools. Here we are at Jesuit institution, go into these halls and look at the images that are portraying the divine. I bet you ain't gonna find a black Jesus on nobody's wall. Why? Because that's a threat. And again, I'm saying white folks, if white folks are upset about character in the Hunger Games being portrayed as black, who was black based off the author who wrote this book, who's Rue.
Rue, yes, Rue.
Little black girl, folks lost their shit about that. Think if you put a black face on Jesus. And I'm not even saying go into the anthropological debate on whether or not Jesus is white or Middle Eastern or nothing like that. I stay away from that, because as a social scientist, I'm looking at what is the most widely disseminated images of Christ. I'm not even getting the argument if he even existed. I'm saying what I can see. What's that impact and what's the effect of that? That's what I'm interested in. So yeah, that's why I was just kind of being quiet.
No, but that's super valid. Like, that is super valid. Like, and a lot of people are like, oh, we were founded on a racist premises, but it's really the ideology of white supremacy and keeping that complex of inferiority and like who is worth being at the table and why they're worth being there, which is a conversation that we still see to this day.
And by us being in the system, again, like I said, it's not necessarily a code word for white people. White people are the beneficiaries of white supremacy, but the way in which a system operates, if it was always bad, then we would have burned this motherfucker down. For lack of better words. But we have to have a system in which you have oppressed people buying into that system, which means that you have these things operating at intersections. Racism, classism, in terms of being a capitalistic society, and patriarchy. So these things are operating in tandem, never sort of separate. So I need to buy into the system and where you have other individuals sort of pitted against each other and buying into these beliefs that, yes, black folks are lazy. You will have other black individuals pairing these things as well. You can go to a black individual and say, well, why do you have an image of a white Christ in your house? And they'll say it doesn't matter because it transcends race. But in that same breath, try to explain to me why it's so important to have a diverse representation of people in the media and on television. So you're going to tell me it's more important to have your child see themselves in this doctor that's on TV than to see themselves in an image of an angel that's in heaven? And if you don't see yourself in heaven, then where are you? Because people don't go to heaven, they in hell. And then so the kid is associating themselves already with badness. What's the impact of that at a very young age? So some of y'all may be familiar with those studies where they had the little kids they ask these kids, these identical dolls, one's black, one's white, which one's a good doll, which one's a bad doll. If you haven't seen it, YouTube it. Overwhelming majority of the black kids always point to the bad dolls, the black one. The ugly dolls, the black doll. They do it with white kids, they've done it with Latino kids. Overwhelming majority are always saying the negative things is the black doll. Then they ask the black kid which doll looks like you. And then that's what's really sort of interesting to watch, because then they realize, like, damn, I'm that doll. I'm the bad doll. I'm the ugly doll. Where they learn this and pick this up from? Yes, media and all these other things, but religion too. Specifically Christianity in the U.S. context.
Wow, yeah, that's powerful. And it got me thinking as well, like, what are some other thoughts about if microaggressions can be committed with a person of color? You know, can a person of color commit a microaggression against a person of color?
Yep,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Definitely.
What was it, a microaggression or is it internalized oppression? I think people of color and minority groups can commit microaggressions in general, like homophobic rhetoric, for instance, but as far as intersectionality goes, but
I'm just thinking a lot about like subjectivity, as we started off with, like, for example, that H&M example so resonating with me, and how the parents didn't think it was still a problem, but everyone else thought it was. The majority of everyone else thought it was a problem, and how microaggressions within communities. For example, I'm a queer Latinx woman, and how my family has a problem with me identifying as queer because I'm in a relationship with a man. So it's just really fascinating to see how technically it's still, to me, them with the way I identify is still a microaggression. So it's technically a microaggression. A microaggression, and how that affects me as a person. But then it goes to that point of intersectionality and how that is seen with another person who is of marginalized communities, and how that is affecting a different identity of a person. So.
Yeah, also going along with socialization, I would say the quote that really stands out to me in Injustice Anywhere, injustice anywhere is injustice everywhere, I believe. But I think that's, like, going back to intersectionality, any, like, injustice is an injustice. And for me, that's, like, the biggest thing. Like, there was actually, like, women, they actually did a similar study with, like, 5-year-old girls, and they found throw like a girl is like internalizing that aspect of that men feel better than girls, like that aspect of that superiority. So it goes beyond that. So I still think injustice anywhere is wrong.
So I'm curious to learn, like, how have you all, how have you dealt with these microaggressions? If you either saw them being committed or if you committed them yourself, how do you deal with these things? Because obviously we talked about, you say any injustice, is bad, right? So, like, what do we do about these issues?
Same thing you do about germs. You just keep using the hand sanitizer. It's everywhere, but you can't see it.
Yeah.
I don't know. What do you do?
0.1% still gets through.
That also goes into the concept of, do you feel like you have the power to change that? So a lot of what we do is like a contextual thing. Like if I'm a student and I see that in a class and my grade is dependent upon that, sometimes I might bring it up if I think that teacher's going to maybe back me up. But if I feel like I'm in a place where I don't get that, I can see that I would keep that quiet, because then it becomes, is this safe for me? to address it. As a staff member, there are certain contexts and places I can bring stuff up, and I have more power than a student, but then I also know the limits of my power, and, you know, in a space like this, sometimes I can bring things up that I cannot bring up, and a committee on a different thing, depending on who's in the room.
That's true.
And then, like, going off of that, I definitely think about the bystander effect that happens a lot as well. Is that there's a lot of these problems that occur, but then, like, I feel like it's innate with us, within us psychologically, if we want to get involved or not, if there would be consequences with our actions or not. And I feel like that's what we deal with a lot, is that bystander effect, is that if we will get involved, what are the consequences? And I feel like people don't want to take on those consequences or whatever that's going to negatively impact them as well.
Yeah. And it's also interesting because sometimes, and I know this, especially as a person of color, I've been in a room with a lot of people, I'm waiting to see if someone else is going to respond. Because I don't want to be the only one. I'm just kind of waiting, like, am I alone here? And I think that that's a big piece too, is, you know, I'm just waiting for something like, it's like, come on, someone else, you heard this, you saw this.
Yeah. And in non-minority settings, you know, in which you're like one of the only, sometimes you don't even know what to do. You know, you look around to try to get, you know, verification, you know, that this happens, you know, feel validated. And sometimes people really don't even realize that they're not, if they're not aware of these issues. You know, so.
Yeah, and with a lack of representation too, if you're speaking up against something when there's a lot of people who hold an ideology, it's kind of like hard when you speaking up and you're not getting that validation, you almost come off as you're wrong when you're actually speaking that something that really does matter. So.
I think earlier we were talking about challenges to overcoming it, and like the idea of privilege, power, not wanting to give that up. I think there's also the issue of white or any kind of majority identity shame, like white guilt, white shame, and how that can be like being into your own history. Like, you know, I was raised in a homophobic society. I colluded with that type of dynamic as an adolescent male, not only in terms of being micro-assaulted as being assumed that I was going to be called faggot or something like that here and there, but also I have to own my own history of being a colluder of that culture, not only because I, you know, sometimes would participate in that to try to avoid being ostracized, but then also needing to learn to acknowledge that and work through it and try to be more of an ally myself. So to do that, to be an ally, to respond, I have to acknowledge my own history, not be limited by my own shame or guilt around my own history, and have the courage to respond. For me, it's oftentimes safer because I've done a lot of that work, and I do have a lot of positionality of power, so I can take some of those risks to be an ally, but not everyone does.
I think it's a point though, it's hard to admit when we also make those mistakes. I mean, and, you know, so I think that that's another big piece, is that all of us have engaged in microaggressions. And, you know, I think that the more you work at it, the more you're able to see those and to see the points of privilege that you have. But that could be a difficult task too. Like, because you do have to like look yourself in the face and say, I have colluded in many different areas.
I just think about like intersectionality and how I feel like I have privilege elsewhere, like my education and my gender, and how sometimes I can't commit, you know, maybe a gender microaggression or sexual orientation microaggression, but I realize that, hey, I have the privilege in which I need to be aware of that, you know, and I need to make sure that I don't continue to invalidate somebody's experiences, you know, just because I may not be able to, you know, understand, you know, there's certain perspective, but I need to be aware of this and the biases that I hold and how that may impact people as well.
I know we're running out of time for today. I don't know, any other, like, just thoughts that people have on this, or, I guess from a positive, or like, yeah, what more do you think that we can do to, you know, help other students, other staff, other people here, if it means Marquette or Milwaukee, through issues like this?
I just think support, just support them and validate their experiences. If we can, even if we can't understand, their certain experience, even though we may hold a different identity as them, just try to sit in their shoes and just try to support them. So validation, I think, is important.
I think it's also important if, like, you, especially as a staff member on a campus, if you hear a microaggression, to, like, nip it in the butt and say something about it. Because most likely there's going to be other students around that have also heard that, and for them to know that you heard it, acknowledged it, and then said, like, don't say this, it just makes that space more inclusive, and then also, like, lets them know that you can be someone that they can go to.
Definitely so.
You're being a flawed role model too, especially for people who need to do more of the work, who are more likely or apt to be the ones committing or engaging in the microaggression. So owning your own flaws and process is important, because then people are more willing to do the work as opposed to wanting to say, oh, I can't say that I'm a racist because that's bad. Speaking of associations of goodness and badness, you need to be able to actually do that.
And go in line with what Jeff was saying. So we do a volunteer program, and one thing that I try to emphasize is that we're co-learners and we're all, like, learning together, because I don't know all the answers, and I also do make mistakes. So owning up that we all make mistakes, I think, makes it a little bit easier for other people to open up to. So, yeah.
Say that, not that I want the last speaking position, but being part of a culture and being the dominant race and gender, and for most of my life, the socioeconomic class, I'm not always aware of the things that I'm culturally and historically conditioned by, and I don't think any of us really are. And so being made aware is a not always comfortable process, but I think it's one that everybody has to commit to in order for anything to change. I'm not going to become aware of anything if it's not brought to my attention. And in some way that requires an assumption of goodwill on everybody's part, that when anybody's offering me some kind of correction, that it's coming from a place of care and love, and that I actually do care, if I'm doing something that offends or hurts, because I do care. I would like to think most people do, but just not always aware.
So yeah, and just continue to educate ourselves. I think that's a big thing. Maybe we can all take Dr. Howard's class.
Yeah.
Like, want to draw some more knowledge?
I mean, you could. We don't necessarily get into microaggressions and the way in which they happen here. I think also the way in which this discussion, if I could get a similar model like this for my psychoprejudice class, I would love it. Because oftentimes it's kind of quiet. I'm like pulling teeth to get people to share. Mm-hmm. But again, this was self-selected. Mm-hmm. Whereas psychoprejudice is somewhat, but it also fills a requirement. Yeah. So if it checks that box, I can sign for the class, but it's not necessarily I'm there to want to participate in this space. But yeah, so if y'all want to join the class, that'd be great.
Graduated.
Yep.